So today we're going to be celebrating Labor Day and all the jobs I've had since the 1970s and the salaries I've made over nearly 50 years of working, as best as I can remember. Some of them I really don't know, but we'll deal with that as we get to it. But before I begin my jobs journey, and trust me, I've had a lot of jobs over the years, a little bit of background on me. I grew up in Brooklyn in a working class household, in a union household. My father was a union member, the telephone workers union with the New York Telephone Company. And we were taught to work hard at a very early age. And basically, I've been doing that since about 12 years old, working since about 12 or 13. And I've been financially on my own, paying my own way since 17 years old when I joined the Navy. We'll get into that as we get into this video. I'm now 60, so I've been working since about 12 years old. A long, long time with a lot of crappy jobs along the way. Some good ones, but a lot of crappy jobs. I've worked for minimum wage. I've worked for six figures with a corner office. I've done just about everything that you could imagine along that pay scale. So let's start with some of the jobs I had in the early 1970s. So I was a paper boy. I was about 12 years old. I had a bike route, and I would deliver newspapers in the neighborhood. I really don't remember how much I made. I do know that I remember being stiffed by some of the people collecting money. Some people would give tips. I probably made a few bucks a week. So that was one of the first jobs I've ever had. Another job I had that I actually enjoyed, and I was also maybe 13, 14 years old at the time. I worked at Mike's Fruit and Vegetable Stand on Gravesend Neck Road in Brooklyn, New York, right underneath the Neck Road train station, selling fruits and vegetables. Now, this was a time before digital scale, so everything had to be weighed manually and then calculated on a paper using fractions. Another job I had in the 1970s is I worked at my grandfather's blacksmith shop in Coney Island. I didn't really get paid, but I learned a lot, and I'm sure him and my uncle gave me some money. I just don't really recall. I know they bought lunch and breakfast, and I'm sure they gave me some spending money over that time. The last job I had in the 1970s before joining the Navy in 1979, I worked as a fishing mate on the Pilot II at a Sheep's Head Bay, Brooklyn, New York. I worked there, I think, 3 summers and maybe 1 winter. The daily rate that I was paid was $20 a day, plus tips, plus a share of whatever fish was caught and sold at the dock. And as a kid, 15, 16, 17 years old, I was making sometimes a couple $100s a week cash during the summer. That's a lot of money. So I was pretty good about that. I enjoyed that job a lot. Then 1979, I went into the Navy. So let's get into jobs I had in the 80s. The first job I had in the 1980s was the U.S. Navy. And I was a machinist mate, 3rd class, petty officer 3rd class. I think my highest pay I made was probably about $700, $750 a month, and that included sea pay and hazardous duty pay. And out of the 4 years active service I spent in the Navy, I spent about 50% of that time at sea, underway, or in deployment, making hazardous duty pay and sea pay. But the one good thing about that job with the Navy, I made lifelong friends, learned a skill, and really made lifelong friends. And it was the only job I've ever had in all these years where every freaking thing is on the line, up to and including your life and the lives of your shipmates. I didn't get along with everybody, obviously, but everybody got the job done, and everybody knew what was on the line. And by the time I got out of the Navy, when I was in my early 20s, I did more shit than most people will ever do in their entire friggin' life, as far as seeing the world, travel, experiences, and all of that. So that was definitely one of the really cool aspects about that job. Okay, so what else did I do in the 1980s as I shuffle my paper notes here? So I held a bunch of jobs out of the Navy and before I took off and spent a year backpacking across Europe. So in the order that I remember them, and they were all paid between $10 and $15 an hour from really the mid 80s. I worked as a commercial air conditioning mechanic, okay, doing work on various shopping malls, businesses, and things like that. I quit that job because it was a really long commute out to Long Island, and then I got a job paying again around the same thing, between 10 and 15 an hour, as an electrical apprentice in Midtown Manhattan. That was a cool job. This was 1984, and I remember seeing a newspaper in the van that John Lennon died, and obviously he died before 1984. I only found out about it then. That's how out of touch I was when I was in the military. And obviously with no internet and all of those things, I really didn't know what happened. I quit that job, and then I was working at a nightclub in New York City that's no longer exists, Roseland, which was a big ballroom nightclub, but it also had disco and live music. I worked as a building engineer there until I got fired, because I refused to do some bullshit work that was not in the engineering realm, because I was a building engineer. And then from there, I worked as a deckhand on an oil tanker, where a buddy of mine was the captain, and that paid $100 cash a day. And I was collecting unemployment from the Roseland gig because I got fired. So I was making some pretty good bank back in the mid 80s, mostly cash. So then when I started college in 85 when I came back from traveling in Europe. And I went to school full time, and I worked full time. I worked as a nighttime security guard, making $12 an hour. And then later on in school, I worked at the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce in Rockefeller Center. I think I was making about $15 an hour there. So both of those jobs really helped pay for all kinds of things while I was going to school. That was the 1980s. The last job in the 80s, I graduated college in 89. I was hired by Shell Oil as an energy analyst for Latin America. So I was doing political and energy analysis, and my starting salary in 1989 out of college was $30,000, which was the most I ever made in my entire life, in a real job, wearing a suit and tie for the first time ever. Let's look at the 1990s now. So I started in the 90s working at Shell Oil as an energy analyst. And then a couple of years later, I was hired by Texaco Latin America, which is headquartered here in Coral Gables, where I live. It used to be headquartered here, they're no longer. I would say that was one of the worst friggin' jobs I ever had in my life. The boss was an anti-Semitic prick. And it was just an absolute horrible, horrible experience. I put up with it because I had a young daughter, and my wife was pregnant at the time. And I got laid off while she was pregnant, which in retrospect was the absolute best thing that ever happened to me, because that made me completely change my entire mindset towards work. And this was, got laid off from Texaco, it was 93. My son was born in 94. So I left the oil industry, and I started working in marketing and advertising. I worked my way up through a couple of different agencies to a senior vice president in the 1990s, making well over $150,000 a year, and had a really nice office, expense account. Nobody ever questioned, because either I was working for big corporations or technology startups that were flush with cash during the dot-com boom and bust days. And then for a year, I was commuting between Miami and Cupertino, California, working as a consultant with Apple Computer Company. That was amazing time, made a shit ton of money, and really learned a lot. So that brings us now to the 2000s, and I left the advertising public relations world shortly after 9/11, and then I took a job with Microsoft. That was probably the second worst job I ever had. Great company, not the right fit for me, not the right work culture, how I like to work. I was an advertising director for Latin America, making, certainly well into the six figures, with bonus and sign-on. It was probably close to 200 a year. I stayed there maybe 18 months and left and started my own business. I had my own marketing consultancy business for almost 15 years. During that time, I was averaging about $200,000 to $300,000 a year in income after expenses. So that now brings us to the mid 2000s. By the mid 2010s, I was completely burnt out as a consultant. I went back to school to Georgetown University. I got an executive master's in nonprofit leadership and management, and I took a job at a local homeless shelter making $60,000 a year. I did that long enough to earn my chops in the nonprofit world, and then I moved on to a different nonprofit as the vice president of marketing, making $120,000 a year. So basically doubled my salary and didn't have the responsibility that I had as a consultant. Now, let's fast forward to the time of COVID. All right. I left the nonprofit world right before COVID started for a whole host of reasons, and I was going to restart my consultancy business. COVID hit. I decided not to relaunch my consultancy business and really to focus on just staying healthy during the beginning of the pandemic. And I wound up doing two very cool jobs during the pandemic. One was I got certified to teach English as a second language. So I was teaching English to Chinese students in China via the computer and different online platforms. That paid $20 an hour. I was making maybe $1,000 a month on average, maybe a little less. And I signed up and became a census supervisor during the 2020 census. So I did that for 6 months at the same time teaching English, and they also paid $20 an hour. So I was kind of doing double dipping on two gigs. The pandemic is more or less behind us now, and I'm no longer obviously working the census. I stopped teaching Chinese students English online about a year ago, and now I'm the CEO of a family foundation that we're in the process of launching, and we are handing and administrating scholarships to first generation college kids that are studying STEM, science, technology, education, and math. And I am back into the six-figure game, and I'm happily doing that basically on a part-time basis. So that's pretty much 48 years of work history since I was 12 years old. And it's been a hell of a ride. So you could leave your work history or comments in the comment section. Take care and enjoy Labor Day weekend.